In front of reporters, Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, a fucking bitch. It's the Social Security Trust Fund.
That's a woman for you. I asked her to get my shirts whiter.
And the hallmark of feminism today is what we call intersectionality.
Hi, conjurers, coven sisters, and co-conspirators. Welcome to the Witch Podcast, the podcast where we examine the roots of internalized misogyny towards reclaiming our individual and collective power. I'm your host and dear friend, currently having an existential crisis, Lauren Eckert. And today we are joined by badass human Kirsten Dobler to discuss cultural appropriation in witchcraft and problematic feminism. Kirsten is an Indigenous academic and language revitalizationist, a passionate educator of settler and Indigenous ancestry, a profoundly rad and thoughtful human, and a very talented Twitter user. Her pronouns are she and her, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, ʷiጡ.
Close, ʷiጡ.
Kirsten is a member of ʷiጡ peoples. Welcome, Kirsten.
Hey, Lakessa. Thank you so much. That is so nice and generous. Kirsten, nuga ʷiጡ, gayuklin la tsakuluten, yuklin la klamatau. So I am Kirsten. I am ʷiጡ from the Waiwakai. My family comes from Tsakuluten, Glu Gwasam, Glu Muskamau Dzauktinu, and I'm currently living in Campbell River on our territory, which is really great.
Amazing. Thank you. And I am recording today not from Tla'amin Nation territory, as I was last time, but from Lekwungen speaking peoples territory of the Wasanich, Lekwungen, and Esquimalt nations. So, introductions aside, we are in the very early stages of this podcast endeavor, but given the title, The Witch, and the plethora of topics we will discuss, it seems utterly necessary to lead early in our audio journey with a discussion on cultural appropriation. Now, the witch in our context is an umbrella term which encompasses all varieties of powerful women, deviant women, untold stories of women's oppression and persecution, feminism, uprisings, and more, including, you guessed it, sometimes witchcraft. But while cultural appropriation and commercialization of culture and toxic whiteness have gained purchase in some witchcraft practices, it has also found opportunities to weasel its way into feminism more broadly. So let's begin there today with a very abridged, can't nearly do it justice peek into defining toxic white feminism. It's so weird how cathartic it is to talk about terrible things.
Well, I think there's a really big strength in sharing our truth. And for a long time, we were told to shut up and be silent and just be nice. And it's fuck that. Nice gets you nowhere.
That should be the slogan for the podcast, or just my life in general right now, relearning that nice gets you nowhere. I'm into that.
Kind gets you lots of places, but nice is fake.
There's a really important distinction between those two things. Okay. Toxic white feminism is, as you well know, no new phenomenon. Indeed, it's present in modern and Western notions of feminism's very roots. So toxic white feminism centers the experiences of and seeks to empower only typically middle and upper class white women, failing to incorporate overlapping systems of oppression, such as racial, economic, gender-based oppression, that impact diverse women, or to fight equitably for women's rights in recognition of intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer, civil rights advocate, philosopher, professor, and scholar. So to prime us for talking about cultural appropriation in witchcraft and beyond, I want to share this quote from, I don't know if you're familiar with Rachel Cargill.
No.
So she's an author, academic, speaker, and activist, and the founder of the Loveland Foundation. And I actually first came upon her via Instagram. And she describes white, fragility-laden, white-centered feminism as, quote, the type of behavior that rests under the guise of feminism only as long as it is comfortable, only as long as it is personally rewarding, only as long as it keeps on brand. But if the history of the feminist movement taught us anything, it is that intersectionality in feminism is vital. We cannot forget the ways that suffragettes dismissed the voices of Black women, sending them to the backs of their marches only for Black activists like Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper to make major moves while fighting for the vote in tandem with their fight for rights as Black people.
That's really powerful, and that's really important because that so exists now. And there's like such a strong pairing between white feminism and white fragility and white privilege. And people that I know, white women that I know, it's like one and the same. And it's like, no, ma'am, like that ain't it.
A way she describes it in the same article later on that I really, really like, that I think speaks directly to that is, if there is not the intentional and action-based inclusion of women of color, then feminism is simply white supremacy in heels.
I had a friend actually recently who I had to pull some boundaries on. I had to establish boundaries, and it actually ended our friendship. But we established our friendship on that guise of like, we get it. Like, we care about things. We're conscious about our mental health. We're conscious about like the way women are treated. And then it got to a point when the Black Lives Matter movement came up, and she was like, what do you mean? Like, and like said the N-word so blatantly. And I was like, we like developed such like a strong relationship so quickly that it was like, oh my God, like what have I done? And then she like learned to twerk just for fun, for clout, to pull it at parties. And it was like, and then she'd ask me like, well, like, I don't even know where to start with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's like, holy, it's like, it's such a guise. Like, you enter into these things and you make these friends who you think you're on the same page with. And then like 3-4 months into your friendship, it's just like, you realize you're like, oh, that was a lie. Like, and I've heard of things happening similarly for other women who make friends white feminist friends who are under the guise of, they're feminists. Like, they get it. We're moving forward. And then something happens where they're asked to step up for Indigenous allies or Black allies or whoever needs to be supported. And they're like, I don't know how to do that. And like, I'm going to do my yoga. And it's like, girl, yeah.
A lot of white Americans, privileged by their race, like, don't see racism in their racist friends because it may not have come up, or they may have made friends recently, or like their racist friends may have been afraid to display their racist beliefs in a previous iteration of the modern world. And so like, there's a lot of racism, and Black and brown and non-white people did not need to be told that, but it was like a wake up for white people who are shielded from it by being white. So
it's true. And I think there's a lot of grace that can be had by people acknowledging that and saying, wow, like that shit really sucks. And like, I'm uncomfortable now. And it's like, good. We're uncomfortable all the time. And like, even as a white passing Indigenous person, uncomfortable lots of the time. But like, definitely not nearly as uncomfortable as my relatives who have dark skin. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, I think we can seed out the good people in that they're like, wow, that shit sucks. Like, let's do something, rather than the people who are like, I don't know, they just like don't give a shit. And which is or apathetic. And it's like, yikes.
Totally. And in this never ending and broken ass year, 2020, white supremacy certainly wears heels. But it dances in other harmful accessories too. I begin with this all too short primer on toxic white feminism because its perpetuation still today and its obstinate disregard for the realities of the oppression of non-white, non-heteronormative women plays directly into the cultural appropriation that we will talk about today, and especially into cultural appropriation in witchcraft practices, which, witchcraft, as I'll I'll talk about in episode 1 is seen by many as an empowered form of feminism, like
societal rebellion. So it's extra unfortunate when it includes cultural appropriation.
That's really cool. I look really forward to listening to that one.
So Kirsten, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how would you define cultural appropriation?
Ooh, that's so good. Well, it's kind of just like taking and co-opting and profiting off of a culture that's not your own, which like is the American dream. And so like it makes sense why so many people are like, I can do whatever I want. And like I had this conversation with my mom recently. She was like, I really like your little cousin's shirt. Can I make that? And I was like, no, an Indigenous artist drew that. So if you wanted to do that, you could pay an Indigenous artist and then print it on your Cricut. But like it's just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And like, just because you have the ability to make something or to like try something out, just because you have access to it doesn't mean it's your place to participate, you know, like, and I think that's a really big step that people are going to have to make and realize that like, you're going to feel bad and it's going to suck. And that's just the way it is. But like, say sorry.
Yeah. And just because it exists doesn't mean it's yours. I found in doing research for this, there's like, I couldn't find any sort of like scholarly definitions that I found particularly compelling. But I found one definition I quite liked from femmagazine.com, which just sort of echoes a lot of what you just said, which is that cultural appropriation is a centuries-old practice of disrespecting a culture by adopting aspects of that culture without regarding the significance of those aspects. Appropriation most commonly happens when people from Eurocentric cultures steal from another culture without respecting or understanding the meaning behind what they stole. The exchange is not mutual and usually only benefits the Eurocentric culture at the expense of the other culture.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that what I'm trying to like get across to as many people as like these conversations start to arise, and especially in kids, because I didn't mention before, but I teach kindergarten. But I think it's really important for all people to know and to teach our kids that like all culture has value and all culture has important things. And in the melting pot of America, those things are erased. And the things that make your community strong, they're erased because they're like, we want you to be American. And like even in Canada, which was just recently described to me as like, well, we're not the crock pot, but we're like, no, we're not the melting pot, we're the crock pot. So like everything's in there together, but we're still all our own things, which is new to me. Like, it's like, yikes. I don't like it at all either. And so, but it's one of those things where North American settler colonization has really pushed these ideas of, well, like, we're Canada, we're America. And it's like, you're all fucking made up, first of all. Canada's 154 years old? And it's like, I saw the best tweet the other day and it was like, oh, how did it go? It was like, we've got beating that's older than your country. And it's like, it's the truth, you know? And it's like, there are artifacts, like I've got artifacts from my ancestors that have been here for a very long time, you know? And so there's things like that. But like, really, when you get down to it, we're all out of whack because we've been fed this idea that like, oh, you're Canadian culture. And it's like, there are ceremonies, there are traditions, there are worldviews that come from every culture that are valid and important. And if you don't have that because you're like however many generations Canadian now, then you're going to be grasping for something. Yeah. And you take the beautiful things from other cultures and it's like, that's not what you should be looking for.
Yeah, well, it's this bizarre thing where it's like the simultaneous pressure for non-white people, Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color to like engage in cultural erasure because you're not American or Canadian or whatever, if you're holding close your own culture, but simultaneous to and paradoxical with white people then adopting those cultures as their own or like commercializing those cultures. It's really weird that both happen at once. If you were an alien, like who is spying on Earth, you would just be like, I cannot, there's no logic to this way of understanding culture. I also think, you just described like the existence of artifacts or locally, or, the knowledge that your ancestors have been where you are or near where you are for 12, 14,000 years, I think so many sort of white people of European descent and many other people, but can't fathom that. Like, I don't know where my great grandparents live. And I think I've seen a couple compelling think pieces that sort of suggest that's one of the roots of white supremacy. Like, that's where we get whiteness is a relatively new construct, and it replaced distinct European cultures.
Yeah, that
like
has
just
so many
the idea
values.
that like you're white or Caucasian, and both of those are made up, and neither of those are true. And there's this whole like, right? Like, what a bizarre. So I think that's all mixed up in cultural appropriation too, but we'll have to do a whole nother episode on that.
Yeah, that's kind of another topic. But I feel like if we can support people in like, well, and this kind of goes just to like towards my like beliefs around being and like my own ancestry, like if we can support people in celebrating their culture and the way they exist, and like, because we all come from somewhere, and like if you've got your own culture, then you can understand why my culture is so special and I want to protect it. You know, and why I don't want you wearing it as a Halloween costume or like.
Exactly. You just quite well predicted where we're going next. So I think it's helpful to think about concrete examples of cultural appropriation. And so that begets the question, where do we begin in the relatively ugly examination of cultural appropriation dressed as empowerment? And this podcast will actually air on that hallowed day, October 31st, the pagan holiday Samhain, the Night of All Souls,
the eve upon which the veil between our world and the other world thins, and the cultural appropriation event of the year. Perhaps we should begin here. Halloween. Now, Kirsten, I've been at Halloween parties with you, which I get to say with much joy. Do you have any thoughts on cultural appropriation within Halloween celebrations?
Yeah. Well, I think that anybody who has a culture that they care about wants it to be like respected, and like going to a party dressed as whatever culture, Indigenous, like Asian cultures, African cultures, like, well, we're all like different kinds of Indigenous, really. So like, sorry, I should have specified, but like, it's just gross. Like, it just invalidates you as a human. And it's like, you see that happening and you're like, those are my relatives. Like, take off that hula skirt. Like, you know how much the Hawaiians are fighting right now to protect their sacred mountain. And so like things like that, where it's like, just so disrespectful, and like, you have witnessed me like go up to people and be like, you shouldn't be wearing that. Do you know, like, that's cultural appropriation, like, do better next time.
As
and,
I
like,
think is appropriate.
Thank you. I've even like had conversations where there was one girl dressed up like Moana, and I was like, oh, where are you from? And she's like, oh, I'm from like this reserve. And it's like, okay, like, you're on your own journey. I'm not here to police you. Like, you can make these choices and be comfortable, because I'm not about telling other Indigenous people what to do. And like, if she felt comfortable and safe dressing up as Moana, even though she's not Polynesian, whatever, like, that's her journey. But that, like, there is even conflict dressing up as other Indigenous groups because of the idea of pan-indigeneity. And so like, even like if I was to dress up as a Hawaiian like hula dancer, like, not okay, you know? And so I think we need to protect that. And I let that girl with maybe just some food for thought, being like, oh, okay.
You had some like greater grievances to that evening that were still on your list to tackle. So
yeah. So there's things like that where it's just like, sometimes it's very outward, but like people really truly don't get it, you know? And like even this past year, Nene Leakes, one of like the Real Housewives of some American city, had on this beautiful, it was a button blanket, and it like looked like regalia, but it was like bougie, and it just hurt because at that time I didn't have a button blanket. And it was how, like, it just hurts, you know, when people don't respect you and so outwardly show it, that they don't respect your culture or they don't respect anybody's culture, you know, and it doesn't matter what you're doing or where you're going. We're not costumes, you know, and when you make us into a costume, it makes us into a caricature, and you're telling us that we're not human.
And in your comment of people not getting it, I think the piece that is hard, especially for white women, like to understand in, wearing something that mimics regalia, is the privilege in being able to access that culture when there are Indigenous peoples worldwide who either can't legally practice their culture, can't practically practice because of like disconnection and lack of access to their nation's traditions, like because of colonization and neocolonization. So it's this like really gross.
It's really sticky territory, and there's cultural appropriation really happening, and like it's people who hold positions of power. And so in my talk recently with my with somebody else that I know talking about cultural appropriation, they were asking, another white lady, she was asking like, well, where do you draw the line? Like where does it go? And it's like, well, if somebody's a minority, and then like don't take their culture, any sort of minority. And it's like, just don't do it, don't make accents, don't like anything.
And, applying that logic to Halloween, like I think in Halloween we see the very essence of, or like the concrete physical of the abstract, ignorant, unintentional, deeply harmful cultural appropriation, which is played out by men and women alike, obviously. But white people, those of non-Indigenous descent, fail to recognize the oppression of Indigenous peoples historically and modernly. And in doing so, like, it's not like this. I think a lot of people assume cultural appropriation doesn't harm anyone because it's easy to assume that if you're white and have never been harmed by cultural appropriation. But in fact, in something as silly as an ignorant Halloween costume, you can be participating in like neocolonization and harming other men and women in what to you feels like a fun display of celebration, but at great cost. And this is actually going to be, unsurprisingly, some repetition of what you just shared.
So I lean heavily in this episode on Dr. Adrienne King.
Shout out to Dr. King.
Blog, Native Appropriations, which is so excellent. And I will link in the show notes for everyone because it's mandatory reading.
Mandatory reading. I love that. Didn't know you could do that on a podcast, but I'm here for it.
It's everyone's assignment today. Is it wearing a cheap cartoonization of Indigenous traditional wear, like a cowboy and Indian's couple's costume, or any other regalia made into a cheap party trick, is just the beginning of a world of Indigenous cultural appropriation. And witchcraft and the rise of neo-paganism in the modern era has played a direct role in this appropriation, even outside of Halloween celebrations. So I'll quote now from Dr. Keene. The problem is that we as Indigenous peoples are constantly situated as fantasy creatures. Kirsten, something you just referred to directly. Think about Peter Pan, where Neverland has mermaids, pirates, and Indians. Or on Halloween, children dress up as monsters, zombies, princesses, Disney characters, and Indians.
Barf.
A lot of that this episode. Beyond the positioning as not real, there is also a pervasive and problematic narrative wherein Native peoples are always mystical and magical and spiritual, able to talk to animals, conjure spirits, perform magic, heal with medicine, and destroy with curses. Think about Grandmother Willow in Pocahontas, or Tonto talking to his bird and horse in The Lone Ranger, or the wolf pack in Twilight. I had kind of like forgotten about the wolf pack in Twilight, and
you
I know.
So can I talk on that for a minute? Because I think that as someone who grew up outside of her community for safety reasons as a child, and has is working to and participating now in community more than I ever have before, but grew up in a very white environment, for lack of any other term. I think that those sentiments are just so harmful to children and so harmful to youth who are in care, who are taken away from their families, whose families are impacted by intergenerational trauma and intergenerational shame towards culture and language. And I think that all of those play such a huge role, just almost like the Disneyfication. And plays a huge role in just bad feelings and then not feeling good enough. And those feelings of I'm not a good enough Indigenous person. I'm not a good enough ʷiጡ. I'm not a good enough First Nations person. And like those things are so perpetuated in culture that like it makes it really hard to navigate, and you feel really bad at a lot of different times. And then you're just like, if somebody's dressed up like that for Halloween, it just like sparks all of that hurt.
Yeah, like the cascade of every iteration of that as a kid growing up without connection.
Yeah, if that's your only source, and just because like representation is so poor and so fantasized, and that's your only representation of a culture, when somebody says, oh, you're Indigenous or you're Native, and then you're like, okay, like this is what I see on Peter Pan, like me as a child, like straight up doing like one of those like calls when my neighbor friend was like, oh, you're Indigenous, do you speak the language? And I was like, yeah, I do. And I like did the Pocahontas thing. And like, that's horrifying. But like, to me, that's what it meant to be Native, because I wasn't connected with my culture. And so it's huge, that fantasization of it. And I think that we need more representation for our kids to see that you can be Indigenous and do everything and be everything. And we're in a transition time right now where I think it's very easily accessible to witness all the hurt in communities. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women are so, so, so important for people to recognize. But we also need to be finding ways to showcase Indigenous joy. Because we're always laughing, and like there's so much joy. And so like first it was like we're only fantasized, and now it's like, oh, only terrible things have happened. And it's like, yes, very terrible things have happened, but there's also so much joy. And so and
excellence, like Indigenous excellence.
Right? Like we have so many kick-ass people and like doing things in all their nations. So like I think and like cultural appropriation puts us back into that box of...
It flattens you.
Yeah, it flattens us. Yeah. Don't flat Stanley us. That's a kid's book if you're not aware.
Oh my God, I am so aware. I remember being really mortified about Flat Stanley. Like I was really upset by that book. And then we like got Flat Stanley and had to send him to someone else. I was very upset.
Because I'd never heard about it till I became a teacher.
I'm very aware of Flat Stanley. I was extremely involved with Flat Stanley as a fourth grader.
You know what? They valued Flat Stanley more than they value most Indigenous people. Okay. We're being honest.
Speaking from the perspective of my fucking fourth grade education in Iowa, we valued Flat Stanley far more than real Indigenous lives. So there you have it.
So shout out to Dr. Adrienne Keene for saying this in a very, very nice, gentle way.
Yeah. And she goes on, I think this part too is really important. And I think this is a piece that in speaking with white friends and family, especially in the States, where I think the education is even worse, the awareness is even worse, which is like incredible. This is awful. But huge yikes. I think this is a piece that a lot of times people aren't aware of. And I think it's also a piece that makes cultural appropriation so gross. So Dr. Adrienne Keene goes on to say, but we're not magical creatures. We're contemporary peoples who are still here and still practice our spiritual traditions that are not akin to a completely imaginary wizarding world, as badass as that wizarding world is. In a fact I often quote on this blog, it wasn't until 1978 that Native peoples were even legally allowed to practice our religious beliefs or possess sacred objects like eagle feathers. Up until that point, there was a coordinated effort through assimilation policies, missionary systems, and cultural genocide to stamp out these traditions, and with them, our existence as Indigenous peoples. We've fought and worked incredibly hard to maintain these practices and pass them on.
Totally. It's so true, and I think that if I can stem off into education for a second,
I think it's all related.
That's what they want from us. They talk about language and culture as like language and culture. Like we want language and culture. And like the BC ministry is like, you need to include Indigenous perspectives. And it just lends itself so well to cultural appropriation. And like I sent an email yesterday to a Vancouver organization who sent an email to schools being like, make some art. We're going to do an art contest. Like show us what a healthy forest looks like. And like show us what a healthy forest looks like to you. And here they were like, here are some examples. forests, sustainability, garbage cleanup, totem poles, canoes. And it's like, what does a totem pole and a canoe have to do with a healthy forest? And so I emailed them and was like pretty nice about it because I try to be gentle. And but they were great. They were like, I emailed them and I was like, how do totem poles and canoes relate to like forests? They like really do, but like canoes more so. But like those are like northern traditions, so like they do in certain ways, but at the same time, when you're sending that out to majority white teachers, you're just asking people to be like, you're almost giving them permission to be like, oh, I'll make a totem pole with my class. And it's like, that's some sacred stuff. Kids doing totem poles as art projects is like, it ain't shit. You know, am I allowed to swear? Okay. And very so like, I emailed them and they were so great. And I was like, what about, and I was like, you could easily say like Indigenous perspectives of a healthy forest. And they were like, oh, like, great, thanks for pointing that out. Like, we've changed it on our website. And it was so refreshing because I'm in conflict so many times with people being like, well, that's not what it said, or like, that's not how I feel. And it's like, you're not Indigenous and you don't have this perspective, which is why I'm sharing it with you. Like, I'm not sharing it with you to make you feel bad. I'm sharing it with you because it could generate harm in Indigenous kids.
Work. Like, you're working to share that.
Well, I'm trying. People are not receptive. But so in schools, they want culture. And they want culture, like culture, like always be drumming, always like, and they want all of these visible representations.
Always be drumming.
Right? And so like what I've said to people when they ask me about things is like, we're Indigenous all the time. We are always in culture. My kids exist as Indigenous kids, whether they're playing Lego or whether they're playing a drum, whether they're coloring a whale or they're coloring a Barbie. I don't know. Like our culture is all around us all the time because we're living it. And so like there are times when there are really nice Indigenous art projects that you can do in a good way, but there are also a lot of things that you can fuck up. And so this summer I engaged in a conversation on Facebook about this woman sharing the moon cycle for the Indigenous culture near where she lives. And like, it's a beautiful project and like they looked great, but I just started asking her questions being like, do you teach this? Do you teach their worldviews? Do you teach their perspectives? And she's like, yeah, I teach this when I do teach about about their moons. And it's like, that's like some very important knowledge that should be passed on by like an auntie or an uncle or an elder. And she's like, yeah, but I know it, so I can teach it. And it's like, no, you can't. Because when you're taking Indigenous knowledge, and relaying it back to children, they're seeing it come from you. And it tells them, first of all, through a white lens. And second of all, the underlying message is that their people don't have that knowledge and that we're not good enough to share that. And that's the message we've been told. That's been colonization. Don't tell those things. And like, if schools took away these things, it's not school's responsibility to put them back in place. It's the school's responsibility to make space for them to be taught by community members.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned, I'm sure it was like exhausting for you to engage in that Facebook conversation, but I learned a lot and you were so measured and eloquent in the process because you were tiptoeing, like even from online, it was easy to perceive, especially in this woman's responses, you were like tiptoeing around her sensitivities, which is bullshit, but also unfortunately seems necessary in these contexts where you just...
Right?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to sort of early on talking about toxic white feminism, that so often, like, we as humans that exist in society, regardless of race, should be held to account by our community. And sometimes that means, like, we're human beings. We fuck up. Like, I fuck up all the time.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing to fuck up.
Everybody fucks.
I feel shame. Like Dr. Brene Brown, who I really want to do an episode on eventually, has done really cool work into like why shame is important, but also how we can more deal with it in a more healthy way as individuals and communities. And there's this reaction, I think, particularly like white educators, white women, like white Instagram influencers in the wellness industry who perceive that part of their identity is being progressive or feminist or whatever, I think when challenged on something like, oh, as we were talking about pre-recording, like when their intention is good and like an appropriate cultural representative says, hey, your intention may be good, but can we like look a little deeper at this and how it may be problematic? The defense system goes into overdrive so quickly, and it must be exhausting. It must be fucking exhausting.
It is exhausting, and it's really hard, and you have to pick your battles, and you have to choose what you want to do, and you need to, like, it's calculated, and like people are tired. And one of the biggest things I think that is the most frustrating in current time is that it's just like exhausting having to be gentle around people. And a perfect example of that is what's happening in Nova Scotia with the Micmac fishery, with the lobsters.
Hey guys, Lauren from the future here. Just a quick note, for those of you who are listening who may not be in Canada or don't know about the Micmac lobster fishery and the conflict between Indigenous fishers who are practicing their right to harvest in their territories and commercial fishers who are opposed to that harvest, I have dropped a bunch of links in the show notes. So more there. Okay, let's carry on.
And so like on and on, like we are constantly being gentle. And white people don't have to be gentle. And like white people, and especially those Nova Scotian commercial fishermen, they're not being gentle. They're lighting things on fire. They're being violent. And the Micmac are not, because we know, and it's proven fact, that as soon as we step up, then they paint us. They're like,
and
they're
it will
angry.
lead to arrests and more violence by white people.
And so it's very, very hard, and it's very, very like emotionally exhausting. And like, I cannot even imagine this, like the struggle. And then it's like, how do we help our relatives, and like doing what you can in those ways. I don't wish that upon anybody, you know, like I wish like human rights and like the ability to be respected as who you are, like it should be a right, and it's not, because of white privilege and white fragility and white superiority that people aren't willing to admit to yet. Totally. It happens in my school all the time.
Yeah. Well, and in researching for this episode, like I had kind of a general construct for where I wanted to go with the narrative, but also just like the pervasiveness. Like I was still clueless about the pervasiveness of so much of this stuff. I think a really good lens that I sort of pursued in this episode as a lens to look at cultural appropriation in like especially white wellness or like white women's wellness is smudging. And yeah, just the pervasiveness of then, like, once I started thinking about smudging as cultural appropriation, oh my God, it's everywhere. Like, even in my, like, intentionally curated Instagram newsfeed, holy shit, it's just, like, yoga and smudging and then, like, some other, like, spiritual practice. It's pervasive. Cultural appropriation is freaking everywhere. So much so that even white people who try and pay attention, I think, are clueless, myself included.
Yeah, it's hard, and we're constantly learning and growing. And I think it's so okay to be like, wow, I really fucked up. And it's like, I'm just going to try to do better.
Totally.
You know, and I think that we're allowed to do better and we're allowed to fuck up. And one of the things that was taught to me recently about part of my culture is that when you fuck up, you say sorry, you make amends, and then you let it go. So like, we also can't hinge ourselves on like, oh, I fucked up and I'll never be good enough. It's like, you fuck up, you apologize appropriately to the appropriate people, and then you can let that free.
Yeah, we don't wallow in self-hate. That's beautiful. I need to work on that.
Yeah, I think that's also very colonial.
I think so too. Capitalistic.
Yeah.
So I want to dive into smudging a little bit. And again, we'll reference from Dr. Keen's blog, especially because I think some people listening to this podcast will disagree maybe at this point with smudging as cultural appropriation. So there are some nuances worth getting into.
I don't know anything about smudging practices in which culture?
So a brief summation is that in like neo-paganism, in witch culture, actually even just like for a number of sort of non-spiritual, non-occult wellness practitioners, the idea of smudging has sort of taken off. And usually that's done with plants like white sage, sort of, which is taken from a playbook of Indigenous nations practice.
Especially in California.
Yeah. Southern California.
Hey, Lauren from the future again. Just a quick note, those nations include the Kuya, the Chumash, the Kameye, the Tongva, and the Louisiana nations.
And I will drop resources to that also in the show notes. So I could have chosen many items or practices as a window through which to examine cultural appropriation, particularly in witchcraft, but the practice of non-Indigenous peoples smudging is so pervasive and so capitalized on that is the window through which we appear today. So for those unfamiliar, smudging broadly is the practice of ceremonial cleansing in which an herb, usually white sage, is lit and the smoke forms part of the involved cleansing process. I think it's important here to note that varieties of smoke cleansing, so not smudging by name, but smoke cleansing, emerge and have been used across sort of countless cultures worldwide. It's one of those practices that are like not ubiquitous, but relatively common amongst cultures. But smudging itself is a complex ceremonial practice used by Indigenous peoples and nations situated in the land modernly referred to as the Americas. So here's another quote from Dr. Keen's blog. I start most mornings by smudging. I love how the smell lingers on me and in my home, and I love that the smell reminds me of native spaces. It makes me feel safe. The medicines I use were all gifted to me by friends or colleagues, or I have a few special ones that I gathered myself. A sweetgrass braid I made with my students while we were with Oneida tribal members on their lands. A bundle of sage gathered at Sacred Stone Camp with my friend from Standing Rock while we were participating in the movement in 2016. When I burn them, I remember where they came from or who gifted them to me, and that's important to me in my practice as well. I also smudge when things are hard or when something has happened and I need to cleanse or recenter. Smudging is grounding to me. It's centering, it's personal. But the continuation of smudging as an Indigenous practice was brutally fought for and hard won. Like many other traditions, the practice of smudging only became legal for Indigenous peoples in North America about 40 years ago. What preceded was hundreds of years of violent oppression and forced assimilation, murder, and imprisonment of medicine men and women, sort of across the Americas by white colonialists and governments. So systemic and government orchestrated kidnapping of children was also part of those assimilation and colonization campaigns. What's more, smudging is still not universally supported in the institutions in which many Indigenous peoples work and live. Smudging is often administratively banned from dorm rooms, offices, and other settler-dominated spaces within settler-dominated institutions.
I have a good friend who was recently won a lawsuit because her landlord kicked her out for smudging. And so she took him to court and she won. And that was a really, really important case. It was in Vancouver. And it was really important because like that now sets the precedent. It was the first thing ever like that. And so like her success was really prayed for and justly deserved. So it's really interesting. And I also think that smudging is an Indigenous practice, but it's not a practice that is done by all Indigenous people. And so I think that there's a lot of people who are aware, but not all people are aware that like it doesn't belong to all Indigenous people. And unless you're taught in a certain way or things were gifted, that like it can be bad medicine. Like if you're not doing things in a good way. And so I think also removing the idea of pan-indigeneity being like, any Indigenous person or any North American Indigenous person can smudge is like also not really the case, which I don't know if that's common knowledge, but I just thought I would interject it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also thinking about that fact speaks to the diversity of such cleansing practices.
Totally.
Where there aren't smudging practices, there may be other smoke cleansing practices with other native plants and with other ceremonial aspects. And rather than being like negative, that's beautiful and incredible and worth learning about. But we end up sort of, we end up with tunnel vision. And maybe don't. Well, and I think, like, building on that too, it's no wonder that seeing a white woman openly smudging as part of her new age pagan practice or
for likes.
Totally for clout on social media, or worse yet, passing a $42 white sage witch starter smudge kit in Sephora.
Yikes.
Yeah, that's a real thing.
Ugh.
Or seeing this stuff in Etsy shops or in
The
TikTok.
audacity.
Exactly. The caucasity. It causes immense pain for Indigenous peoples who either can't practice this because the access to the resources has been limited by colonization and environmental degradation that it causes, or because it's not within their practice and they're aware of that, like, or they couldn't practice it until, 40 years ago. The late 1970s was very recently.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Keene sort of finishes her blog on smudging by saying, I am going so in depth here to show you that smudge stick is not benign. It's not about ownership. That smudge stick represents the deep pain, sacrifice, resistance, and refusal of Native peoples. It represents a continuing legacy of marginalizing and punishing Native spirituality. So when our religious practices are mocked through these products, or folks are commodifying and making money off our ceremonies, it's not about who has the right to buy or sell. It's about power.
It's about power, and it's about respect. And it's about understanding that not everything is for you. And not everything should be profitable. And I think that's just a whole 12 podcasts on its own. But not everything is profitable, and nor should it be profitable. Things can just be.
Let's actually, maybe we should just start a separate podcast all on how capitalism is a dumb lie that's ruining everything.
That's it, though. It's a dumb lie that's ruining everything. It's made
it up.
I say this to my counselor all the time, but it's money's fake. Just give people enough money they need to live. And who gives a fuck? It's all fake.
This is going to put us in the fringe.
Yeah, we might get, maybe you could cut that out, but might get blacklisted.
I saw a great tweet yesterday that was something like, imagine aliens watching from space, the conversation they'd be having right now, okay, wait, so they're destroying...
The conversation they are having,
exactly.
Let's be real.
Okay, so they're destroying their planet, even though they have the technology to fix it, because they're worried they won't have enough green paper. And the other alien says yeah, no, that's it. They're worried they'll run out of the green paper doing that. And they're like, what? How do they get the green paper? And they're like, oh, they make it. It's what a stupid, absurdist. Oh, God. Basically, I just wanted to quickly touch on, and I think you can cover this well, I know one of the arguments against it talking about cultural appropriation is oh, well, but it's actually cultural appreciation. So I wanted to very briefly touch on that, how to avoid toxic white feminism, because we all, all white people have some of it. And then how to, if you want to practice witchy things, here are ways to do it that you're not being a huge dick. So
that's so the appreciation part of it all is just it's the good intentions, and it's to hell with your good intentions, if you are not being respectful, and it just it's so contingent on respect, and if you do not respect people, then how can you appreciate their culture? And it's just an out. And it's oh, I respect these. And it's obviously you don't respect these people, whoever it is, because you're dressing up as them. And people are not a costume. And you know what? Characters are a costume, but also there's a lot of tokenization in the world. And if you are tokenizing somebody, that's not being respectful. And so any character that is based in tokenization is not respectful. And so that needs to be well understood, in that it's not okay. Pocahontas, not okay. Tiger Lily, not okay.
Not okay.
And like, if you were to watch the Peter Pan now, it's atrocious. And it's like, you don't even remember it half as bad as it is. And it's just like such bad, like, just like interpretations. And like, is that what people genuinely thought? Like,
right.
Probably, you know?
I mean, probably not far from it. And this is, so you've alluded to this a little bit too. I think some people in hearing this stuff, and I know like I had this thought in doing this research too, you have these moments of like, oh fuck, where you like hear through old actions from a new, more informed lens and are like, oh damn it, I fucked that up, or like, oh, I'm engaging in a cultural appropriation in this way. And you've definitely already mentioned this, but I think it's like, I don't know, I'm not even going to get into cancel culture because that's like a whole other conversation. But there's value to being held accountable, but there's also value to moving on, sort of as you talked about. And speaking of Tiger Lily, I have a very distinct memory of being, probably 5 or 6 years old and doing play pretend with one of my other little white friends in Iowa. And we were play pretending to be Indians, and Tiger Lily was one of our names. I don't remember what the other one was. And
Lion Daffodil.
Yeah, exactly. Like Lion Daffodil. They're so products of like the factory of
right, and the harm that you were inflicting as children unknowingly, because Disney gave that to you. Disney put those thoughts into your brain. Yeah,
it's gross.
It's not an excuse too, but I think there's like something to say. We have to hold space for the fact that like we all live in the system, and some of us have way more privilege and power, and those of us who do are the most poorly trained to understand any of it.
Well, I think you just don't have that experience.
Well, exactly. None of it. We're shielded from it our whole lives. So but I think there's like, if you're listening to this and like, oh shit, something I do may be cultural appropriation, that recognition is important.
Yeah, hold space
you
for
have
it.
Every opportunity.
Be uncomfortable.
Exactly.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Shit's uncomfortable.
Being uncomfy is great. Yeah.
But then like, do better. Acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And especially if you have kids or work in a capacity with children, it's important that we do better so that our kids don't make the same mistakes that we do, and to show them. Absolutely. And it goes into every realm. It's to like provide accurate, positive representation of all races, ethnicities, genders, like gender orientation. Like if you are in close proximity to kids, like make it okay for a kid to be whoever they are, and like don't push your colonial beliefs on them. And when people do, like, shut it out. Be like, excuse me, or call it out and be like, oh, that's not nice. A nice person doesn't do, or a kind person, or that doesn't fill my bucket, you know?
I like that. That doesn't fill my bucket. Well, that's very good.
Kindergarten talk for you.
You have some really good kindergarten talk. It brings me great joy.
Yeah, it's, shit's rough. But, like, the only way to do better is to acknowledge the discomfort and know that it's going to continue to be uncomfortable, and the discomfort you're feeling right now, minorities feel all the fucking time. All the time.
And I don't think there's a world in which like myself or other white women can ever truly understand that. Like we can like hear it and have compassion for it, but I think it's foolish to like, we will never understand because we never have to live it, which is unjust and total bullshit.
It's so interesting. And I think it almost even like ties back to the absurdity of like white feminism, in that there like should be a very small window, but it doesn't seem to exist. Mm-hmm. You know, like you should at least have like a little bit more empathy, or be able to see like, you know, we know those feelings of unjustness. And so it's like, you know how it feels to like be mistreated as a woman because you're a woman. Yeah. And so like, it's like, take that, but understand it's worse and it's constant and it's visible.
And you also still have to deal with the discomfort of being a woman. Like you have to do both.
Yeah. And so like, so like the intersectionality of it all is really how I think we're going to get anywhere, is just understanding that like respect people how they want to be respected, you know, and like embrace difference, which is like sounds very hippie, but like it's not, because like hippies also appropriate our culture of the butt. But I think hippies understanding assuming Indigenous cultures relates back to what I was saying about every culture has value, and those people could probably really benefit from connecting with their own culture.
Yeah, absolutely. They're like, where white people in particular are like have no through line to culture, and I think it leaves a lot of people lost and stealing other cultures.
Go home, do your DNA test, go to Scandinavia, go to wherever, and like, they'll probably also don't want you there stealing their culture.
Yeah.
But
piece it all together. Yeah. But I think all of those comments are a pretty good place to wrap things up, especially because you're having your self-care day. And before we lead into wrap up here, I want to focus specifically on witchcraft, as is appropriate given the namesake of this podcast and the witch-oriented books piled on my desk here. And I lean again on Dr. Adrienne Keene and return to the lens of smudging. Quote, all of this to say, find out what your own ancestors may have burned for cleansing and use that. Unless you're native, it probably wasn't white sage. Sorry, I know you're not used to hearing you can't have something, but you can't have this. Before you storm off in an entitled huff, I honestly don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home. If you're gifted medicines by native folks and are taught how to properly use them, more power to you. Just don't turn around and sell them or sell ceremonies. And I also want to include here a short list of ways to avoid unintentional or ignorant harm in your practice, whether that be witchy or otherwise. And I've included, of course, links to the fantastic websites, which I got some of this information from, in the show notes. So I include an excellent article called 13 Smoke-Free Ways to Cleanse for some ideas that don't use smoke or white sage. I also suggest avoiding the term spirit animal. This is an appropriated Native American First Nations practice. Other cultures, so Celts, Norsemen, and Scandinavian cultures, among others, do have histories and spiritualities of revering animal spirits that guide them or protect them. So consider using specific terms related to your heritage to avoid appropriation, like familiar, animal companion, or a fjolger, Norse Germanic term. Another great one is patronus. Also consider deeply practices that you might incorporate into wellness routines that may include the appropriation of Hinduism in the form of Hindu gods or goddesses, chakras, yoga practices, etc. I will include some links to that as well. And finally, religions and cultures of spiritual practice that have been adopted by the occult, like Santeria, Brujeria, voodoo and hoodoo practices, etc., are closed religions that require often ancestry and invitation to practice. Removed from their cultural context and leveraged by white peoples without invitation, these are immensely problematic. This is all to say that aside from the superficial list of some shortcuts to avoiding cultural appropriation, we all have a lot of work to do to dig deeper into our practices and analyze our relationships and power structures that enable them.
I have one more story that, like, I hope resonates, just because, like, the absurdity of it all, and just the facade that schools get it, that educators get it, that administrators get it. This past holiday season, so 2019, we were doing, I'm teaching a language program, so we're as language immersion as possible. As our language gets better, we include it more, and like our kids, they're just great. So we were like, what are we going to do for the Christmas concert? Because like you have to, actually I think they called it a Christmas concert, real secular. So we have this song from our elders, and it's called ʷiጡ daxŭ, which is like 10 little deer, and it's the tune of 10 little Indians, but like we're reclaiming it. Our kids are up there, they look stinking cute. And so we're practicing this, and then the Aboriginal education teacher says to my co-teacher, one of our language teachers, she says, like, do you think like that's appropriate? Like, do you think people will be okay with like using that tune? And it was like, yeah, we're reclaiming it. Like, they're going to be so distracted at the cuteness of our kids. And also, like, as Indigenous people, we have the power to do that.
Totally.
And it's a song that was like also written by one of our elders, which is like, yeah, we're doing it. So the dress rehearsal comes and like we do it. It's great. They're fine. And then one of the grade 5 classes go on and they're doing the fucking Hawaii song. And like there's girls up on there like dancing like hula dancers. And it's like, are you fucking kidding me? I'm getting policed for reclaiming a song, and you're letting actual cultural appropriation happen on that stage. And it's like, you really don't get it. It happens all the time, everywhere. And it's like, people are like, yeah, I get it. I'm woke. And it's like, you don't fucking get it.
Well, and I think there's so much like I don't even want to say cultural value, because this is like, I think, a negative thing. There's like this superficial value in culture based on feigned wokeness rather than like the messy reality.
People are like, I'm including it, so it's good. And it's like, you're not including it in a good way, so it's not good.
Like, I don't know, all of these things, decolonization, real feminism that's intersectional, they're messy as hell. Like, they're not easily packageable into a category like woke. They include a lot of like dealing with shame if you're a white person and seeking to transform it to actually be like an effective human. And I think that it's
just like a really solid like example of cultural appropriation in the school system. In my current context, where I'm getting policed still, and nobody's saying anything about the cultural appropriation. And it's like, stop telling me that your school is trying. So it's like, it's everywhere, and like, don't do it, you know? And if you feel like something is not right, then like do some research, Google it, see what you find. There's probably so many people have done so much good work in sharing, and they've done the emotional labor, and like Google has it there. And like, not always, but lots of the time. Like, even once in university, I was co-organizing something, and the girl was another white girl. She was my like partner, and she was like, oh, we're going to do this henna fundraiser. And it's like, that's cultural appropriation. You can't. And she was so mad at me. And then like, we never did it because like I was speaking the truth, but it's where is it? It's you doing it, like this white girl, like it's not some wonderful Indian person who's sharing their culture. It's like, you're like, I can do henna. And it's like, no.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, this kind of heads in the yoga direction too, but like there are like our awareness, our cultural awareness seems to be like stairs that we step up, and we can tackle that like, oh, is this 10 Indian song? That's not appropriate, but not recognize that Hawaii is in a state of like modern colonization and appropriating Hawaiian culture is gross, or recognize that like yoga and henna tattoos aren't ours. Like, that's higher up on the staircase and we're slow as fuck getting up. Like,
it's just tiring being like, am I the only person who sees this? And then my aunt's there who's been working, right? She's been in the school for a long time. And she's like, we've always been tokenized. And it's like, fuck, you know? We need more people to get on the same page so that like people whose culture is being appropriated don't need to do the emotional labor. We need more people to get on board, question things, you know, and ask questions. And if you see something and you think, oh, that's kind of interesting, like I don't know about that, or even something where somebody says something. If somebody says something and you get hurt by it, take that hurt, Google it, learn from it, you know?
Yeah.
Even in the way that like when I was a child, I got cornrows every summer because it was a cool thing to do. And you look back and you're like, that ain't shit, you know? Braids like are a part of Indigenous culture, but like not in the same way they are part of African culture. There was no place for me to do that. And it's like, it's not something I'm ever going to do again, but it's something to learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm referring back to Rachel Cargill here in that great piece she wrote about white feminism, because it sums up a lot of both the anecdotes and what we've been talking about, and is a call for women, white women in particular, to like embrace intersectional feminism and decolonization, like in our bones, as the first step to not fucking up, or just like not even not fucking up. We're always going to fuck up, but as the first step to like becoming an actual ally and avoiding cultural appropriation. So I'm going to read sort of the end of that article now because I think it's excellent. Quote, so what does allyship actually look like? Except in the reality of this country's dynamics, this country referring to America, but quite certainly applying to Canada too. White skin yields white privilege, and an ally is willing to use their privilege to fight with and for those who are marginalized. Allyship means voting for elected officials who have a track record of ensuring the most marginalized among us are heard and advocated for. Allyship means using your sphere of influence, whether it be your dining room table or the boardroom of your company, to call out racist actions and ideals. Allyship means uplifting the voices and experience of people of color so that we are not continuously drowned out and ignored. What makes allyship so hard for most? Many liberal white women have an immediate reaction of defense when someone challenges their intentions. And it is in that precise moment they need to stop and realize they are actually part of the problem. It is never the offender who gets to decide when they've offended someone. If you feel yourself dismissing the words or experiences of people of color because you think they're overreacting, or because you didn't know, or because it has nothing to do with race, it's often due to your ego, not rationale. Listen and learn instead. Dr. Robin DiAngelo, a white woman socialist who studies critical discourse, reminds us in her new book, White Fragility, that the key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. We can use it as a door out, blame the messenger, and disregard the message. Or we can use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? What would it mean for me if this were true? Racism is as American and Canadian as pie. In order for the feminist movement to truly be progressive...
That's sugar pie.
It's sugar pie. That's perfect. In order for the feminist movement to be truly progressive and intersectional, white women must face this fact and begin to take on their load of work. We are long overdue to dismantle the system which, if it is not intentionally and aggressively addressed, will defeat us all in the end.
Can I add a quote to that I just shared recently? From the Instagram account No White Saviors, and it's, whiteness teaches you that you are the solution to the needs in Black and brown communities. Confronting your unearned power, privilege, and access should result in a shift towards true collaboration where the community leads and you follow. And I think that's so important. And I think that that's it. And that's to hell with good intentions. Like, your intentions mean nothing if you're not collaborating, if you're not putting other voices before you. Like, even I do my best to put more visible Indigenous people in ahead of me. Because, like, as white passing, I'm very easily digestible and, like, a little sneaky in there sometimes. But, like, people need to see, and, like, people need to be uplifted. And, like, this is where we're at. We need to be uplifting people. And we need to make sure that their names are being seen, their voices are being heard. Even if they have the same ideas as us, put them up there. Like, they should be seen. Which is, like, I mean, us talking right now is good. It's true, though. These conversations need to happen in all contexts, and everything is a stepping stone. Other one that I shared that I really love is accountability feels a lot like bullying when you're used to being praised for your harmful behavior, which is like the white lady mantra. And it's like, yeah, you feel bad and you think I'm being mean to you, but I'm holding you accountable because you're in a position of power over all of these Indigenous kids and you're not being respectful.
And coming back to cultural appropriation, like, you've never been told that you can't have this. So it feels like bullying. It feels like an offense because you haven't been socialized to not take.
Yeah, exactly. And, like, we need to move to a place where you can acknowledge and celebrate and, like, give to... It's really hard for a lot of people. And, like, it sucks to be told no, but at the same time, like, fucking boundaries. All these white women, they, like, talk about how boundaries are so important, and it's like, oh, but you're refusing to accept other people's boundaries. Goes both ways, bitches.
Yeah, funny that, right? Kirsten, this has been so amazing.
Thank you for having me.
I'm filled with joy and anger. Like, so much simultaneous joy and anger.
Joy and anger.
God.
That's it, though. I learned... Can I share with you the word for fiery?
Yes, please.
Because that's how I am. On a, like, day-to-day basis, I go to school fiery. Fired up. I don't know... Like, I don't know how this year's gonna go, but, like, I'm just very angry and I'm ready at any moment. And, like, that's a byproduct of working in a colonial institution and trying to decolonize myself and my classroom. And it's like, I'm constantly ready to fight for what I need and what my kids need. So I learned, so it's hak alan nok I. And it's my spirit is fiery. That. So my elder, my Otter, shared that with me, and I was like, yes. It was good. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really Ola Gala Eek.
Do you have any pluggables you want to share as a sign off, like any social media accounts or organizations or etc.?
Well, we actually
including your own social media accounts.
So my Instagram is at @Dobler, KDOBLER. My Twitter account is at KGDobs.
And your Twitter account is full of fire hot takes.
It's a great time.
I love it.
Like, there's like, it's like unsearchable by LinkedIn people, which is on purpose. But like, hey, if you want to give me a follow, I'll take it.
Amazing.
Don't show my boss. Yeah, that's it. And we recently made a website called likwalamas.com for our language learning. So if you are Kwakwaka'wakw or a Kwakwala speaker or want to learn Kwakwala Likwala, there are some resources on that website that I made, which is really cool. And like wherever you live, learn whose land you're living on, like learn how to say thank you in the language and like give back. Yeah. Skoden. Absolutely. Land back. Yeah, Queed.
Land back.
It's true. And like also land back means our autonomy to decide what happens to the land.
Yes,
we're not about kicking people out, as we never were. Actually means like some radicals are. It's like, no, let us protect our relatives, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Quick question on the website. So we'll link that in the show notes. If someone wants to support you, like if someone is listening, wants to support that, how can they do that?
That is a good question. We do not have a donate button.
Okay.
I think wherever you are, donate to language in your community, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
Like find out who's doing the language work and like, I don't know, support them. Thanks
for being so rad. I really fucking miss you right now. It's making me kind of, I'm like mad and joyful and now I'm like kind of sad.
Okay. Enjoy your emotions. We all feel them and it sucks. But they're so important. As a recovering bottler of emotions, like we gotta feel them or else they're gonna explode. Mentos really Coke, it's bad.
Well, it's also all men. That's why men are so fucked up.
Don't you
Mentos
know
and
it?
Coke. All men.
Oh, they're trying. Well, some of them.
And as always, you can find us at The Witch Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you would like to hear us improve our audio quality or buy me a coffee, please consider supporting us on Patreon, link in the show notes. And if you have any great ideas for forthcoming episodes, hit me up at our email, thewitchpodcast@gmail.com, spelled exactly as you would expect. On that note, until next time, stay powerful and find your way today to hex the patriarchy.